Australian Aboriginals have kept the most accurate oral histories in the world. Some of their legends are more than 10,000 years old. They accurately tell of the sinking of the land bridge between Australia and Tasmania, catastrophic flooding we have geological evidence for, and first-hand accounts of long-extinct creatures. And it's here we stop for a quick addendum, the first of several, because while we in English call these stories dream times, because they're technically set outside of time in a state of constant present, the way we address them in English makes them feel like they're just stories. And they're not just stories to the people who tell these stories and sing these songs. Their actual name is Chikorpa, and they're very relevant to these people's everyday lives and their modern day life, and they're a living record of their ancestors and their fables and their traditions, and that is important to know going forward. So, moving on. Chikorpa is several things, but we're going to focus on the oral history that it relies on. We people who use the written word have had a history of dismissing those that don't. Oral history is often treated as a lesser form of record-keeping, with colonial researchers assuming that 1. Cultures that didn't write their history down are none worth telling, and 2. That all stories were fake because the widely held belief at the time was that a memory can't survive longer than a century without drift rendering it useless. They demeaned these myths when they were first written down, and that, combined with the rapid decline of native populations in Australia due to horrific government policy and disease, means that we have a lot of Christian interpretation and not a lot of accuracy. Which is a shame, because we know from geological surveys and a whole lot of digging that many of these things described in these stories are accurate. There are 21 separate stories that describe lands once transversable being swallowed by water. Most notable is the Gidingi, Aboriginal name for the island Fitzroy, Gabbard, meaning the lower arm of a former mainland promontory. The last time Gabbard was connected to the mainland was at the end of the last ice age, when the sea was 98 feet lower. That was 10,000 years ago! You look me in my eyes and you tell me that a 10,000-year-old memory passed down through 400 generations is not bomb as hell in my eyes. It's tight as fuck. So with all of this in mind, I'm going to try my best to tell you a good story or two. Let's get started. So this is the story of the first woman to walk upon the land, were Aborigine. She more or less walked out of the sea and then started walking across the land. She had a child everywhere she went, putting them down on the earth and telling them that this is where they lived and this is what their language would be. This is what you speak. This is where you live. This is your language. These are your words. She did this across the continent before fading away somewhere in the southern hemisphere. See, what's whack about this origin myth from the Aborigine people is that it's more than the Tower of Babel. This is technically true. Researchers associated with the National Australian University have found that not only are all Aboriginal languages connected, but they all originate from a spot in Queensland, Australia about 4,000 years ago, someplace up by the coast. So the working theory is this. Strap in. Somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 years ago, waves of small migrations moved across the land. These people moved in small groups, stopped in villages, convinced the entire village to speak the way they do. Yes, they did. Boned just enough to leave genetic evidence of their existence behind, and then either continued on their migration south or assimilated into the village. And this way, old languages that had been around for tens of thousands of years were replaced fairly quickly and then evolved the usual drift from there. Listen, I'm not joking here. That's exactly what people think happened. This tribe sent out a bunch of dudes, and they boned their way across the continent, making babies as they went, and they went up to people in villages and like, hey, we speak a language. This is your language now. You have no choice. And people were like, that's chill. Want to marry my daughter? Congratulations on your horny children, Aborigine. Native Australians can preserve these memories because of several unique facets of their culture. First, the native tribes were isolated together for 65,000 years, ever since they crossed the sinking land bridge into Australia. There were no outside cultures to contaminate their stories, nothing to invade, no one to marry, no one to argue with. 2, they have an incredibly strict culture of fact-checking the storyteller that includes multiple generations of fact-checkers, youth, elders, the storytellers themselves, and the people around them. But the most important upkeep of the Chikorpa are songlines. Second addendum, hi. Hello. Here we run into more translation problems. You see, the word songlines was coined by this dude named Bruce Chapman, and Bruce Chapman, seconds after he published his book, was immediately dragged to hell by all of his colleagues. They're like, Bruce, that's stupid, that's a dumb idea, what are you doing? Because his ideas limited Aboriginal storytelling to like this roadmap or this GPS of Australia, when in reality it's more like an encyclopedia of the known world. Every plant, creature, stone, watering hole, path was documented into an oral story that could be passed down from generation to generation, encoding that knowledge in the culture. It's like an easy to remember survival guide. A better word would be Charinga tracks, but song lines stuck, so now that's what we use when we talk about it in English. So knowing that, song lines are paths cut across Australia that are documented via oral histories. They're kind of hard to explain without visuals, so I'll try my best to lay these out with some landmarks. Because that's what song lines are. They're landmarks. Places where the knowledge is literally encoded into the earth. Every landmark is associated with a piece of a story, which would teach about something important. Someone well taught could guide themselves from watering hole to cave to hunting grounds by reciting the words to a song. At each site, a tribe would perform rituals and sing songs that solidified information crucial to survival, about plants and animals and migration routes and weather patterns, explanations of their traditions and their laws. They didn't need to write anything down because their whole world was a memory device. By making their record system the literal Earth itself, they've managed to keep accurate stories from before fucking cuneiform was invented, and an encyclopedic level of knowledge about Australia's flora and fauna. It was the duty of tribal elders to maintain these lines of landmarks and the stories that were encoded in them. Youth would learn the entire history of their people, in stages, by learning these song cycles in stages. Some stories of the ancestors traveled great distances, and so tribes would maintain a section of it, and then their neighbors the next part, and so on until one could follow the story across the continent and back. Neighbors often interacted based on obligations encoded in the song lines that they shared. The most well-known of these is the tale of the Seven Sisters. They were 7 beautiful women who lived in a cave until the day Waitiniru shows up and accosts them with a massive dog strapped around his waist, not to be confused with his actual penis, which is separate. The sisters flee, making a path across Australia all the way to the sea before leaping into the sky to become 7 stars, the stars we think of as Orion. The start of this songline is at the Cave Hills site, where a groove in the rock was supposedly made by Waitiniru's companion Dong, the penis strapped around his waist. This story is literally encoded into the rock. You can touch that groove today, and you can sit down, on certain days, if you're a tourist and you got a permit, and listen to someone tell this story in the cave where it started. Over 250 languages were spoken at the time colonists arrived on the continent, but now only 13 are still being actively learned by children, and 100 more are only spoken by elders of their tribes. This is due to this devastation wrought by the colonial government. Aboriginal languages were banned in schools until as recent as 1990. The last residential school, which tore native children from their families and placed them in dorms, was closed in 1983. For example, here's a quote from linguist Arthur Campbell, quote, "Government policy looks forward to the loss of the Aboriginal languages, so that the Aborigines may be assimilated. The idea was that native languages impaired critical thinking and stunted your brain. But there are language revival movements in native communities, public schools that are offering optional programs, community centers offering classes to the little ones to learn the language of their tribe. They learn words even their parents don't know. They go, and they sing songs, and they play with little flashcards, and they come home, and they tell their parents that I learned the word for bird. I learned the word for koala. And their parents are like, whoa, I didn't know that word existed. And that's pretty stinking cool. Here's one more story before you go, one which is much older than the other 3 and which has its own song line along the Tungawa River, which is the Murray River on English maps. Long ago, the people of the Water Rat tribe lived in relative peace along the river, until one day they saw something giant. The hui, a 6-legged lizard that moved slowly along the bank with long, ponderous steps. They thought it was no threat because it was slow, until they discovered an entire tribe had been eaten by it in the night. The hui slowly swallowing them whole in its great maw, leaving behind no one and waking not a single sleeper, moving as silently as the wind between the reeds. It devastated the tribes along the river, feasting on 60 people at a time before disappearing into the night and into its burrow to rest for weeks. The cycle continued until the Water Rat tribe called upon the other tribes around them for aid. They sent warriors deep into its cave to set a fire, and then set another fire at the entrance. Once the hui came out, roaring and yelling, they killed it, leaving behind only the sand banks it would raise along the Tongawa as proof of its existence. And here's a giant lizard called a megalania, which coexisted with the native Australians for at least 10,000 years before dying out. Debatably killed by the native Australians, but we're not really sure. It was at least 18 feet long and 1,200 pounds. There's another aboriginal myth about this cutie, the thylacine, and how it got its coat. The myth dates to before they went extinct in mainland Australia, and that was about 3,000 years ago, after the mainland bridge fell, but before they went extinct in Tasmania, which wasn't until 1936, when a zoo threw the last body of the thylacine in the trash because they thought they would catch another one in the brush. Yes, I'm still mad about it. I just want to leave you with a quote about a court case in British Columbia. No, it's not Australia, but it fits with the sentiments of what we've been talking about. It spanned a few decades, but the gist is that it made oral history permissible evidence in court. It's an interesting case. You should look it up. I'm going to spell it out below and link it so that I don't butcher the name of a very important tribe. Here's the quote. It happened at a meeting between an Indian community in northwest British Columbia and some government officials. The officials claimed the land for the government. The natives were astonished by this claim. They couldn't understand what these relative newcomers were talking about. Finally, one of the elders put what was bothering them in the form of a question. "If this is your land," he asked, "where are your stories?"